Hi and welcome to another episode of the Sports Psych Show. Today I'm going to be speaking with Jeremy Holt and Dr. Will Thomas, who are from the Centre for Team Excellence. And unsurprisingly, as the name suggests, we're going to be talking about creating great teams. These guys have worked in a range of sports. They've worked with the Royal Marines and with a number of organisations. Now, this is of course a sports psychology show, but we in sport can learn so much about what they do in the military and in business to help us get better at high performing in sport. So I know these guys are going to bring a number of tools and techniques to the table that we can all use. So Jeremy and Will, great to have you on. Thanks for joining us today.
Hi Dan.
Hi Dan, it's great to be on.
Fantastic. Now, so the audience can put a voice to a name, why don't you both do a brief introduction? So, Jeremy, since you're the founder and the CEO of Centre for Team Excellence, why don't you go first?
Yeah, sure. Hi. My name's Jeremy Holt. I'm an occupational psychologist by training, and I've worked with teams and leaders for about 30 years now. Initially, that was all within organisations, so sort of big corporates. About 12 or 13 years ago, I started doing some work with the military, and sports teams has been the last 3, 4, 5 years, really.
Fantastic. And Will?
Hi, I'm Will, and I've been working for Jeremy for a couple of years now, and we started our relationship with me doing a PhD at Sussex University probably about 5 years ago now, and originally before that I was a business psychologist, and the PhD with Jeremy and Centre for Team Excellence really focused on, what is it that creates high-performing team and distinguishes those teams which really perform at the top of their game from those that are less successful. So hopefully we'll be going over some of that research within the pod, and just to say that it's great to be on this series, and I've really enjoyed the other podcasts. So looking forward to being involved.
You've enjoyed my rambles with my guests. Great, fantastic, and it's great to have you guys on. And I was saying off air there to you, Will, that I discovered you on Twitter and nearly jumped out of my seat when I saw that you guys are working every single day with sports teams to help to help them team. So I think it's just going to be a brilliant hour or so conversation. I know you're both passionate about sport yourself. Jeremy, you're a bit of a rugby man, and Will, you're a Spurs fan, I believe.
Yeah, massive Spurs fan, which I know you are as well, Dan. So I think we're going to get along well.
Yes, and football's not a bad sport, is it? But when rugby's around, then I'm afraid that has to take precedence there, Dan.
And so you guys have started to get more involved in sport, and I know you've been pretty active in the hockey area. You did a little bit of work with the GB women's team who won the gold medal in Rio a few years ago.
Yeah, so the background to that is that you really have to go back sort of 6 or 7 years. So I'd been working with corporates and I'd been working with the military, and I was looking at the way in which I approach developing teams, particularly working with military leaders, because the consequences of making mistakes when you're working with senior military teams are quite severe. In business you lose a bit of money, but in defence you potentially get people killed. So I was looking at the sort of approaches that were being used and the approaches I've been using. And I just felt there was something lacking in terms of really understanding the psychology behind what was going on in a team that was successful that didn't happen in ordinary teams. And the more I looked, the more I realised I couldn't really find any good research on it. So I went to Professor Rupert Brown, who's at University of Sussex, who I knew from my undergraduate days, and just said, look, is there any way we can do some research into this? So to cut a long story short, that's what resulted in funding for the PhD that Will participated in, 3-year study, which I'm sure he's going to talk to you about shortly. And as part of that study, one of the participants was the Great Britain women's and men's hockey teams, as well as a number of other elite level teams performing at that sort of international or professional level.
that cues Will in, doesn't it, to talk a bit about that PhD?
Yeah, sure. So the perspective that it comes from is, and the work that Rupert Brown's done and a lot of other leading researchers in this area, looks at the role of social identity. So you obviously have your personal identity, which concerns your individual characteristics and how you interact in one-on-one situations. And then you have group identity, what psychologists term social identities, and those are the behaviours that you exhibit when you're in group situations. And the more you identify with a team, the stronger that emotional connection becomes, and that can have, or the research shows that has a load of positive effects on a number of different things. So the research shows that it increases learning, well-being, increases resilience, obviously a key one for sport there, innovation, job satisfaction, decrease in stress and cliques and infighting. So there's a whole spectrum of positive outcomes that are associated when an individual identifies with a group. So they identify as being part of that group and feeling that they have a sense of belonging. So there's that whole backdrop to the research, and I guess what we wanted to do was to really try and understand what is the relationship between social identification and performance, and also specifically in a sports environment. So the research we did was all with sports teams, so I guess that's where we got the connection with GB hockey and all these other sports teams. And then secondly, to understand why do people identify with a team in the first place. So those are the two studies that we've done, and those are the two bits of research that I can go through now if you'd like.
Please do.
Yeah. So the first study looked at performance. So that's actually recently been published in British Journal of Social Psychology, only a month ago actually. So within academia and research, the research took place going back about 3 years ago now, and collected the data, but within academia, I don't know if you know how these things work, but it all takes quite a long time to get through the publication process.
Oh, yes.
But the main findings from that were that, so the researchers showed a connection between identity and performance previously, and what we wanted to establish was what came first. Did identity predict performance, or did performance predict identity? And the overwhelming effect was that actually identity came first. So identity had a strong predictive effect on performance. And the way we were able to establish that was that we did a longitudinal study over 6 months, analysing over 50 teams in several different countries and across 14 different sports. So it was a large-scale study, and we did another analysis which took the teams with the lowest identity, so the teams with the weakest identity, the bottom 20% of teams, and compared those teams to the top 20% of teams in terms of the strength of their identity, and we found the difference in terms of performance between those two sets of teams was 53%. So it's a massive performance jump. It's not a marginal gain we're talking about here. It's a type of performance difference which, it could explain something like Leicester winning the title, for example. It's a really, really significant performance jump. And the other interesting thing in that bit of research was that those teams that had a strong identity actually became stronger over time, and those that had a weak identity actually became weaker. So there's a big divergence in the strength of people's identification with a team. And so I guess then if you want to look at the second research study, which got published last year, so again it's fairly new research in this area, it really looked at, there's this whole spectrum of positive outcomes, including performance. Then the next question is why? Why do people identify with a team? What are the underlying identity motives? And so there's 5 key beliefs which the research showed, and these 5 beliefs explain up to 89% of the variance in identification. So try and not use as much psychobabble as I can here, but
no, you're doing well.
those identity beliefs concern, so the first one is continuity. So if the team has a past, if there's a legacy and it translates into the present and leads on to the future, then people are more likely to identify with the team. The second one is meaning. So if there's an important purpose and belief to a team that is beyond some vague aspiration to win, then again, players are more likely to identify with the team. The next is distinctive. So if the team has something unique, something different that makes them different and distinguishes them from other teams, then again, people are more likely to identify. The fourth one is belonging. So if people feel they're connected to other people and have a strong glue that binds them together, and the team has cliques and infighting, then again, people are more likely to identify. And the last one is efficacy. So if people feel like the team is competent and capable to achieving their goals, their ambitions, then again, they're more likely to identify with. So those are the 5 key beliefs, which there's a bit of a psychological language in there, and what we've tried to do, and what Jeremy will probably talk about later, is we've turned those 5 core beliefs to creating a strong identity and a strong team into a practical model called TRIBE, which is an acronym which we're obviously TRIBE has 5 letters. So we've managed to get those 5 beliefs into the 5 letters of TRIBE, which I'm sure Jay will talk a bit more about in detail later.
Okay, so fascinating. Let's strip this back. So, let's say we've got a group of a squad or a group of 15, 20 players. Let's call it 20 players. So every single, what the psychological literature is saying is every single person within that group has their own unique personal identity. Would that be the correct thing to say?
Yeah, I think that's a very helpful way to think about it, is to think about it from the individual perspective, because once we start talking about things like team identity, it's a bit like when we talk about culture. I listened to your podcast with Damien Hughes, and obviously loads of fantastic insights coming from that. But just the idea of culture is kind of, for lots of people, that feels very woolly, and they're not quite sure what that means and what should I do with that. But it's the same with identity. So, but if you flip it around and think about it from the other perspective, it makes it easier. So as an individual, I have an identity, and that's my sense of who I am. It's my self-esteem. It's a sense of what I stand for, where have I come from, what am I doing here, where am I going, what kind of person do I want to be? And it drives...
Jeremy, sorry to interrupt. Does that include personality dimensions as well, or not so much? Is it more the narrative around your personality?
It's a bit of a mixture of the two. So the theoretical approach that our work is built on is something called social identity theory. And what that says is that who I am has got 2 components, and they interact in a very dynamic and variable way. And one component is my self as an individual, so me when I'm on my own, which is perhaps driven by my personality, my DNA, my early life experiences, and that's part of my sense of who myself. And perhaps if I'm just thinking about me when I'm driving somewhere or sitting on the bus, that could be the kind of me that I'm thinking about. But we also need to recognize that we're highly social animals, and that actually our sense of self is very dynamic and it changes. So when you go and watch Spurs play, Dan, I imagine that your sense of yourself is very different to you perhaps when you're at work, when you're being professional, you're paying a lot of attention, you're being very impartial, and then you go and watch Spurs play and you're not impartial, you're partial. The referee's decisions are terrible if they go against Spurs, and you know how to behave. You get excited when Spurs do well, and you get disappointed when Spurs do badly. And there's no rule book that says when I turn up at a football match, I need to behave like other people in the crowd. There's no rule book that says to be a Spurs fan, I behave in this way, whereas if I was an Arsenal fan, I'd behave in that way. And yet what people do when they're in group situations is they use their ability to be highly attuned to what is expected of me and what does it mean to be part of this group, and they integrate that into their sense of self. And then, of course, you get on the tube and you go home, and that changes. You flip into something else. So when we start realizing that actually who we are is something that's dynamic and it changes, then the interesting question becomes not what is it to be selfish. It's you have to ask, what is the self that we're being selfish in favor of? So we often talk about athletes being selfish, that they're pursuing their own goals. But in certain circumstances, when they belong to a strong team, those goals are the team's goals, because they think of themselves first and foremost as a member of that team. It's become part of their sense of their self. And when the team does well, they feel amazing. And it doesn't have to be them who scored the goal or scored the try or put the final putt in on the Ryder Cup a couple of weeks ago. It's about collective success, because the collective and the self and the individual has become integrated.
So when that group identity becomes a part of my own personal identity, that's when I'm really contributing to the group.
Yeah, that's when I become emotionally attached to the group. And what you find, the sort of language that people use when they're really strongly identifying with a team is, they talk about it almost like it's a love affair, that they're so emotionally engaged. It means so much to them. And certainly you find that if you look at, for instance, the Royal Marines. So when someone jumps off a helicopter into a combat zone in the Royal Marines, they're not doing that for Queen and country. They're not doing that even for the Royal Marines or for their commando unit. They're doing that because of the very strong emotional bond they have with all of those, plus the people who are jumping off the helicopter next to them, their oppos. And for forces like the Royal Marines to thrive, they have to create an incredibly strong sense of identification so that people will perhaps make the ultimate sacrifice for the benefit of the group. And that's the process that's going on. It's that kind of unification and deep emotional connection with it.
So sorry, Jeremy, are you saying, if you take something like the Marines, are you saying that group identity is actually aligned with other individuals more so than, say, a higher concept of Queen and country?
Yes, and part of that is that I have a concept of myself as a Royal Marine, which embodies me, which is based on some beliefs about how I should behave in different circumstances. And if I don't behave in ways which are consistent with that, then I'm not just betraying other people around me. I'm betraying myself. I'm not being authentic to who I am, because it's become part of who I am. And so what the Royal Marines are really great at doing, and not just the Royal Marines, we've worked with the Army, Navy and Air Force, but people who work in that environment, they're great at designing a process that takes a bunch of individuals, takes away their sense of individual identity and replaces it with a sense of collective identity for their regiment or for their corps.
That last thing you said there was really, really interesting in a sporting landscape, because I'm certainly not going against your research, because I'm wholeheartedly in favour of it and hearing what you're saying. In team sport, doesn't there have to be a sense of individual identity there alongside the team identity for an individual to flourish, or am I getting that wrong?
I think there has to be a sense of role clarity. So I think that people need to understand where they fit into the whole. So identification is a process which it embeds you with some fundamental beliefs that you reference. And then within that context, you express your individuality. So what I'm not talking about is a harmonization where everybody becomes the same. I'm talking about a situation where people hold deeply held beliefs about how they should be when they're in that context, and that drives their behavior. So if you were to make a comparison with, for instance, Steve Peters' chimp model. So for those of you who don't know about it, the chimp model talks about who you are being composed of a human, which is the person you want to be, the authentic you, a chimp who's sitting on your shoulder saying, no, don't do that. Be afraid, be angry, freeze, run, or fight. And a computer, and both the chimp and the human go to the computer as its source of data. So when I look at a situation, is this a terrifying situation? Is this scary? Should I be anxious about this situation or not? And what team identity is it's the operating system of that computer. So what we're trying to do when we work with teams is we're trying to help the team to reprogram the computer so that that operating system means that when I think about a situation and I consider it to be threatening, for instance, that I see it in a different way because I'm part of this team, and it allows me to not even have that kind of chimp hijack, because the chimp goes and has a look and it just says, oh no, it's not a threat, it's fine, it's okay, you missed the goal, it doesn't matter. You missed the penalty. In this team, that doesn't matter. In this context, that doesn't matter. What matters is what you do next, not what you did last, because you can't change that.
I think you were going to jump in there, Will.
Just to come back to your point, really, Dan, about social identity does not mean having a homogeneous group of people. Actually, its individual distinctiveness can actually contribute to creating a team identity if each person in that group has a sense that they contribute something different, something distinctive. And I mean, just to bring it back to sort of a real sporting example. So if you have a player going through on goal, an occasion that happens 100 times every Saturday, and if they shoot on goal, they've got a 30% chance of scoring. But if they pass to a teammate, that teammate's got a 70% chance of scoring. So if they're acting as in terms of their individual self, then they'll shoot. So they are acting in a selfish manner. They're putting their needs first. They want to get however many goals per season, then they're going to shoot. If they're acting in their collective self, so their social identity, and that happens when a team identity is strong and those fundamental beliefs that we talked about earlier are in place, then they'll pass. And it's not just in a goal-scoring situation, that those type of decisions happen throughout the club, so across training, across what they do in the back room when they go to the gym, how many hours they put in, whether they have that extra pint for dinner or whatever it is. Those decisions happen across the team and can greatly impact performance. And it is, to bring it back to Pep Guardiola at City, for example, and the identity that he's installed there. You look at when his players score a goal, they'll point to the guy who assisted them and recognise that, this wasn't just my goal. I'm not going to go in front of all the fans and say it's all about me. This is actually a collective goal, and I'm recognising you for passing that ball to me. So it's identity is very much a me within a system of a team rather than a homogeneous collective of individuals, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And so do you think, talking about using the example there of the striker going in and on goal and passing or shooting rather than passing, and that sort of acting as an individual, would you say, or have you found evidence that star players, no matter the sport, star players can detract from team performance, or can detract from group identity and subsequently from team performance?
Yeah, it's not research that we've been involved with particularly, but there's something called the too much talent effect. So this is the idea that if you get a collection of stars and you put them all together in one team, then actually it can have significant negative effect on the team's performance, which is not what you think. If you put, sort of the Galacticos example, you put all these great players together, then you expect them to do well. But actually, going back to Damien Hughes and the Barcelona way, that creating that culture, that performance identity, whatever you want to call it, can actually overcome those collection of individual stars more often than not.
Yeah, but interestingly, again going back to that, what the thesis within Damien's book is that commitment culture that Barcelona have apparently built versus, as you say, the Real Madrid model, which is the star model, which I think this comes from the research in Silicon Valley, is that the star model is more inconsistent from an output, from an outcome, from a performance perspective than the commitment model. I mean, is that something? Have you guys seen that in industry? Because I know you work a lot in organisations. Have you seen that overtly or just anecdotally?
Well, there's certainly research in the organisational sector about exactly this. So there was some research done back in, I think it was the mid-90s, by a guy called Hollander, and they looked at the disparity between pay levels within a team, and if you had a few highly paid stars amongst a group of people who were on ordinary kinds of salaries, that had a negative impact on performance, and it was better to try and harmonise things to become more effective. And yeah, you see that. I mean, certainly within the city, a number of years ago, they started hiring whole teams, because rather than individual superstar analysts or traders or bankers, because they recognise that when you take people out of their context, they're no longer able to perform in the way that they did before. That actually it's the whole unit that is delivering the performance.
So you have a collective intervention called Tribe that works to help improve group identity, and you've kind of identified those 5 areas: continuity, meaning, distinctive, belonging, efficacy. I think it would be really useful for the audience just to I know you briefly touched upon them, Will, but I think they're really, really important areas. So can we just expand a little bit on each one? So if we start with continuity and what that means, in what sense does continuity help promote group identity?
So this is the first foundation for strong team identity, and we call it traditions. And so continuity here is continuity over time. So for people to get a strong sense of who I am, they tell themselves a story about where I've come from, who I am now, where I want to be in the future, and what do I want to be remembered for. And for them to buy into or identify strongly with a team, that team needs to fit into that internal narrative that they have about themselves, or to influence that internal narrative. And so that's what the Traditions Foundation is about. And for all of these things, what I think an important thing to understand is, for each foundation, the process that we're talking about here is to set up opportunities for people to discuss their beliefs about this, for instance. So we would talk about what's the magic that's made us successful over time? What's the golden thread that's run through this team that we should be preserving, that we should take forwards? Those conversations achieve 2 things. One is that you move towards agreement, and agreement around what that is important, because shared beliefs are an important part of this.
I think, sorry to interject, Jeremy, because I think this is a really fascinating area, because I know in the white paper that you guys have produced, which give people a snapshot of what you do, and you'll give out an address to sign up for that at the end of the show, but you refer to the All Blacks, for instance, the New Zealand rugby team, quite a lot. And when you think of continuity, it's something they're so strong in. And it strikes me, you've alluded to this, emanates from conversation, having conversation with key stakeholders, having conversation with team members, with auxiliary members of staff, if that's what you want to call them, and the organisation as a whole. And it's really interesting, because I can imagine for some organisations this is quite easy, and I think this is such a, having been in rugby and done some stuff in rugby, I can imagine the All Blacks, they're at a bit of an advantage, because there's that kind of natural, sort of the ability to have conversation around being a Pacific Islander, around, in New Zealand it's quite a small community, and that community effect, if you like. Whereas, and if you think about Barcelona, the Catalan link, again, actually, I'm not saying an easy conversation to have, but an easier conversation to have around continuity and tradition. Whereas I suppose for some sporting teams, that's not as easy, is it? Because they don't necessarily have that history.
No, I think that's absolutely true. And, people often ask the question about what happens at elite level sport translate into what happens for us, for instance, in community sport or youth sport. How can we make that work for us? But actually, it's a process of reflection and putting things on the table for discussion that I think makes the difference. So yes, of course, the All Blacks are able to talk about their great pass back to the originals, and they're able to talk about great All Blacks that have happened in the past. And actually, what they've done is they've embedded a lot of rituals in order to recognise that. So, for instance, when you go and get your first cap as an All Black, you're given a book, and in that book there's the history of the All Blacks, and it tells the story of the All Blacks, and then there's a blank page and it has your name on it. And the question that you're being asked is, what in this story, how are you going to write your chapter in this story? Now, that's a big story to tell, and it means a lot to that nation, and so you could argue that that's an easier proposition. But actually, what a lot of teams don't do is even bother to have that kind of conversation. And just to give you a sort of practical example, we're working with a team at the moment where one of the things that they've decided was that although they've been playing together for a number of years, it's a Paralympic sport, that they didn't even know how many people had caps because they hadn't decided how many caps, what they were going to give caps out for. And so having a conversation about that and recognizing that they hadn't really paid much attention to what had gone before, that they'd lost a lot of the lessons that had been learnt in the past, was a big step forward for them. And then they started to do some research and they started to think about it. And now they're putting together that sort of shared understanding. And I think even for people, operating with sort of amateur sports, it's possible to have a conversation about what did we do last season? How did we get on? What made us successful last season? What were the great moments that we had last season? Or even just this season if you've got a new team. Some of the practical things that we're trying to do with leaders when we work with leaders of teams is to get them to start to think about how can I create an opportunity to enable a discussion. So perhaps it's the end of the first month of the season. Is that an opportunity for me to have a review about what are the lessons that we have learned? What are we becoming as a team? What's made us successful so far? What's our golden thread? And what do we want it to look like in another month's time? So the timeframes can be quite short, and it doesn't have to be a long conversation. But once I've put a thought into someone's head, then I'm allowing them to make connections. Even if I don't have the answers to all of the questions, I'm allowing them to go away and think about it and start to say, that's interesting, that could be important.
Look, you know what, I love what you're both saying there, because you said amateur sport, I think grassroots, and grassroots clubs can do this, they really can. It costs nothing to have a conversation, and it costs nothing to start. It's you're kind of alluding to there, Jeremy, just to start this process. As you've keenly answered my question there with saying, well, yeah, it's great to have that All Blacks tradition and history, but even if you don't have any tradition and history, you can still, let's just start this process. Let's have an appreciative inquiry on what's gone well last season, or what's going well this season. What strengths have we got in the room? What characteristics actually work for us? So I love that, and I also love this idea. Something I wrote down was embed rituals. You could take those sort of character strengths in the room or best moments and just put them on a bit of card and print them off, and everybody carries them around with them. And that's again, that can be done at grassroots, can't it? So there's some pretty simple stuff that can be actioned upon.
Yeah, we're trying to make it practical. And I'm sure you've come across a guy called Rusty Earnshaw and another guy called John Fletcher. So these are
the Magic Academy,
Magic Academy, and really, I think doing very pioneering work around skill acquisition in sport. And I've been very influenced by conversations I've had with Rusty, and one of the challenges he had to us was, well, okay, but how could you make this into something which is a small thing that a coach could do? And what the Magic Academy have is a set of challenge cards for coaches. You can go online. I have to get some commission off Rusty for this, but you can go online, you can buy a pack of cards for £20. They're really fantastic. And there are challenges in there for coaches, and there are challenges in there for players. So you can just give a player a card and say, I want you to do this. We can tell them what's on it and say, I want you to do this for the next 10 minutes. So we've been working on exactly the same thing. You know, it's nothing like borrowing other people's ideas, but we've been working on exactly the same thing in the area of identity and culture, and putting together a deck of cards, which push people to have conversations. So, for instance, we might have an idea about what makes our team successful. I'm sure we'll go on and talk a bit more about the other parts of Tribe, but we might have an idea about what makes our team successful. What gives us an edge? But I could just give to a player. I could say to a player, right, what I'd like you to do after a match or before a match is go over and talk to one of the supporters. So in a children's team, you know, that might be someone else's mum or dad, and tell them what you think gives your team an edge on the pitch, and ask them if they agree, and listen to their answer, and then come and report back to us. So that's a very short intervention, but already what's happened is they've had to think about, do I know what gives us an edge? Have I thought about that? Can I explain that to somebody else? Can I check the feedback? So I'm seeking feedback now, and then can I feed it back to the team? So lots of small little challenges enable you to start a bigger conversation.
Moving from continuity, and please excuse me if we've sort of covered or semi-covered this, but next one was meaning.
Will, how about you having a shot at that one?
Go for it, Will. Just, I know you briefly explained it, but just give us a bit more meat on the bone, or meaning on the bone.
Give you a bit more meaning to it. Yeah. Meaning is all about creating that core purpose, that why for what you do, and why do you turn up in the morning? And it's more than turning up for the paycheck. So I don't know. At City, we went up and spoke to the psychologist there, Pete Lindsay.
I know Pete very well.
He's a great guy. We had a good conversation with him, and me and Jeremy both came away with it. And what they're doing up there in terms of their identity is very similar to the stuff that we'd recommend, and they're embedding that sense that it's more than just the club. They're looking at the identity of being a city and everything that happened behind that. And I know that they've even brought poets in, isn't that right, Jay?
They brought in Mancunian poet to write a poem for Manchester City. If you've watched that program on Amazon Prime, you'll see that they've got language and imagery around the changing rooms, which is around trying to create a consistent sense of meaning within the team. The England rugby team under Stuart Lancaster, I think they were quite ahead of their time in that they got people who had helped players to get to represent England to write them letters, and then these letters were given to them in a session. And that was about connecting you with other people around you. So that the key thing here is, and this was something that Pete Lindsay talked to us about, is if you have a group of superstar players, as they do at Manchester City, and they're all paid so much money, and they could be paid even more money potentially if they go on a transfer to somewhere else. What can you give them that's particularly special about Manchester City? And that has to be around this sense of actually this is a meaningful club and this is a meaningful moment. And here is an opportunity for you to do something which you will never be able to repeat in the rest of your life.
Yeah, I was pausing there actually to think about Manchester City and the work at Manchester City and it comes back to trying to help those star players, trying to help them align themselves with the group, and how challenging that must be, and that challenge for Pep Guardiola. I love the poem idea. I love the idea that words, that language can bring people together. I really do. Distinctive. Could you explain distinctive for us a bit more?
You want to hear that, Jeremy?
Yeah, so just working through our tribe model. So for us, traditions was the T, the R is about being meaningful, and the I stands for identity, and that's about being able to distinguish yourself from others. So it's about being distinctive. So what is it that makes this team different to other teams? No one got excited to belong to a team that was just the same as every other team that had ever gone before, and so when you study teams that are particularly successful, they have some sense of what it is that makes them different. And this has to show through. I mean, you can have actually a very distinctive team that doesn't necessarily perform very well because that distinctiveness doesn't relate to what happens on the pitch. So quite a lot of the work we do with teams is around trying to help them find out what gives them an edge on the pitch, which can become part of their sense of who they are, so that they have this in their mind all of the time, that they're in training all the time, that they're playing together.
And I suppose that notion could build a collective efficacy, a collective confidence. We are different from these other teams. This is what we do. This is how we go about art, and that's a differentiation. And again, I can think of some of the clubs, I suppose specifically in soccer and football that I've worked with, who could actually be empowered by that, who may have had lesser crowds or been smaller or not had the same kind of budget that the bigger clubs have had or have, and actually having conversations, as you say, around what's distinctive with us, what do we bring to the pitch that's different, and then really being emboldened by that. I think creating a narrative around that must be really powerful from a confidence perspective.
Yeah, I think it is, and also you see where clubs get it wrong. I mean, actually, when you're looking at professional sport, we have to consider the fan base as well. And so, if what you're trying to deliver is a way of being, a way of playing the game which is inconsistent with that tradition of your club, with what your fans think is meaningful about this club, then you get an enormous clash. And I think that's what we're seeing at Manchester United at the moment. And you may remember last season, Leeds United came up with a new badge, a new emblem for their shirt, which was really panned by fans, and the idea was abandoned very quickly. And that's because I think these things have not really given consideration to this fundamental question of who are we and what makes us different. And, again, we're talking at this kind of elite level, and it might seem a bit abstract for your average coach. But actually, this plays out throughout life. So the psychologist Erik Erikson, who is a sort of psychoanalytic psychologist from 1950s, who's been very influential, he talked about one of the fundamental challenges of growing up being to resolve the paradox between, on the one hand, what I'm trying to do is as I grow up, I'm trying to differentiate myself. I'm born as this kind of pink mushy thing, and I'm kind of undifferentiated from my mother and then my family and my parents. And as I grow up, my challenge is to become a different person to them, to become an individual, to develop an identity. So on the one hand, I'm trying to be different, but on the other hand, I also have a deep-seated, profound need to belong, to understand where I fit in, to be cared for and to be loved for. And what you see with teenagers is that comes through in the kind of clothes that they wear and the gangs that they join. If you've got a teenage child and they talk about people being emos or something like that, then what are they doing? They're saying, I'm an individual, I'm different to my parents, but actually I do it whilst I'm all the same. We all dress the same and we have our code, but it's different to your code. So that's how it plays out with children. When I start thinking about children who are participating in youth sport, and I coach a youth rugby team, giving children the opportunity to express that in a sporting environment is actually really powerful, because it allows you to do that with all of those fantastic virtues that come with sport that I think we probably all, anyone who's involved in sport, strongly believes that it's has the opportunity to be an influence for good. It shapes people. It helps them to be able to compete. It helps them to be able to develop self-control and respect, and that these are important societal characteristics. So by building a strong sense of team within your youth team, I think that you create something there which is quite important to the development of the children that you're coaching.
Just as you're talking about teenagers there, I was kind of visualising that scene from Monty Python Life of Brian, where Graham Chapman's character, Brian, shouts out the window to about 2,000 individuals, or 2,000 people, "You're all individuals," and they sort of shout, "Yes, we're all individuals." So it's that kind of conflict there between, we are individuals, but actually, we're sort of all part of a group. Follow the shoe, no, follow the whatever it was,
exactly right, Dan.
And
in a nutshell.
Bringing it back to, you mentioned a football team there, and I can think of teams who have moved stadium, for instance, and they might have 20 or 30,000 capacity increase. Their turnover has subsequently gone up, but results have taken a turn for the worst, and possibly, and I'm sure it's impossible to create a causal link here, but possibly, as a result of the stadium move, where fans certainly feel that there's a sort of loss of identity and their own distinctive identity, loss of feeling, and we're going to move on to belonging in a second, feeling of belonging to this, I'm a West Ham fan, I'm at the Boleyn Ground, this is our home, this has been our home for 100 years, and then suddenly it's, I'm a West Ham fan, we're now at the London Stadium, and it's and we're a million miles away from the pitch, and the club are doing the right thing for the club, but at the same time they're losing that sense of distinctiveness, and the meaning is changing, and the continuity is lost. So there's kind of those top three being lost, if you like, or shifting.
Yeah, and the sad thing for organisations like West Ham, and you hear it with other teams as well, is that there's no need for them to have that kind of break, because there is a story to be told. It's just the story hasn't been told, or they haven't thought about the ingredients of the story, and they haven't thought about involving the fans in that process, so you end up with commercial objectives overriding the kind of needs of one of your key stakeholder groups, actually, if you're a football team.
Yeah, absolutely. It's absolutely no criticism of West Ham. If anything, for football clubs, I think what you're talking about is something exciting for them, that actually that you can move stadiums, you can advance, you can develop your club in lots of ways. Just strive to understand and develop, understand and develop and embed the narrative across the organisation, I think, is what you're saying. And I actually look back at, you mentioned Manchester United there, and the reality is, look, working in elite sport, what is what goes on the inside is often not what's talked about on the outside. So one has to be very careful when one makes judgments about what is happening. Yeah. But, Sir Alex Ferguson left his role as Manchester United manager. It didn't turn out to be a successful reign from David Moyes and Louis van Gaal, and now Jose Mourinho is at this time as we're speaking is challenged. But we don't know what's going on the inside. But what we know is, from the outcomes over the last 6 years, is the transition from Sir Alex Ferguson, who did this incredible job, just didn't quite happen. And it isn't attributing blame on David Moyes, and it isn't attributing blame on Manchester United, but somewhere someone or something or some part of the organisation hasn't necessarily done what you're talking about, which is to control the narrative.
And if you compare that or contrast that to the All Blacks, I think it really makes your point. So the All Blacks rebooted their culture in around about 2003 because they were transitioning and struggling to transition from an amateur game to a professional game. And in particular, the introduction of substitutions changed the way that rugby union happened and what you needed to do to be successful. But then they've really strived for a lot of continuity of story, and there's a guy called Gilbert Anoka who's been with the All Blacks for ever.
The Whisperer he's known as, right?
And I think he's what Damien Hughes would call a cultural architect. We would call him a culture carrier or an identity carrier. He's one of those people who knows the story and he keeps telling it and telling it and telling it. And they've had continuity as well in the way in which they develop their managers and their leadership team. So, they went from Graham Henry through to Steve Hansen. Steve Hansen was an assistant to Graham Henry before he took over, and so the continuity will roll on. Gilbert Anoka, I think, has been involved with the All Blacks for more than 500 tests. That's outlasting even players like Dan Carter and Richie McCaw. So there's a huge amount of, in organisation psychology, we talk about organisational wisdom, understanding who we are and what is authentically us, and being able to transmit that in a kind of structured and sensible way is important for organisations to succeed. And I think that's something that Man United lost, perhaps for circumstances that they couldn't foresee.
Organisational wisdom. I'm going to steal that shamelessly from you, Jeremy. I love that. Thank you very much for that. Okay, moving on to belonging. So the B in tribe is belonging, and it's part of your 6 characteristics as well.
Yeah. So belonging is it's the glue that binds you together. It's the standards of behaviour that you instill in the team. And I think with all of this, one of the very important points to remember is that teams can't go and copy the All Blacks identity. You can't copy someone else's identity. And actually, when you're a leader in a team, you can't necessarily just tell team members what their identity is. It's very important that this is a co-creation of identity, and it's a bottom-up process. So team members need to be involved. If you're going to create standards of behaviour, or if you're going to create values, I don't massively like that term values, but people use it and it can be effective, then it needs to be a bottom-up process. And I think that those standards of behaviour must be created by the group, and it should be, what are the implications of these in terms of what you actually do day to day, rather than something being too abstract and fluffy that no one ever really listens to. So, yeah, that's very important when it comes to belonging.
Co-creation and bottom-up, those two words really hit me. Co-creation is sort of my buzz term, or has been over the last couple of years, because I think coaches, and this is, I think, a really important point you're making there, is that I've found over my sort of 15, 20 years in this business is that coaches are quick to say, well, we did a team meeting and we got our values or our behaviours or objectives and I drove that and I presented that to the players, and I think sport is slowly coming round to this notion of actually it's the players themselves that have to be actively involved. This is, if the coaches are going to be involved, it's a facilitation, it's a guidance, it's offering choice, it's bringing in a language maybe that as a coach you might have a preferred language, and that's okay. You will set some boundaries, they might be tactical or strategical boundaries, but you need your players to develop these, to come up with these, to develop these, to drive these, don't you?
Yeah, and I think that the common misconception around leadership and being a coach role is that it's about it's about the individual. They're going back to the great man theories of leadership. That's sort of where that whole stems from. But the new research and what's become more and more accepted, certainly within the psychology of leadership and that area is that leadership isn't about I, it's about we, and it's about creating that sense of we and that sense of us. And you can only do that if it is a bottom-up process and if it is a co-creation. There's some really good research at the moment from two world leaders in this area, really, a guy called Alex Haslam and Steve Riker. And they've got a model called CARE, and this is an identity leadership model. So again, it's an acronym. We love our acronyms.
We do.
So the first one is create. So it's about creating that identity, and I guess that's where the tribe stuff sort of fits in. And then the next one is advancing. So being a champion of your team and really putting the team first. And then the R stands for represent. So that's around embodying your team and being an identity representative of it. Beyond beyond your team. When you speak to other people, you're representing that team. And the last one is embedding. So that's obviously around embedding identity and the actual practical things you can do to facilitate that identity. So there's a lot of research now which certainly backs up your point, Dan, that it is around co-creation and it is around a bottom-up process. And if you don't do that, you just tell people, here you go, this is your identity. That's not going to mean anything to them, and it's not going to work, basically.
Moving on to that final, the E in tribe and it's efficacy in your 6 or 5 characteristics. Talk to me about efficacy and effectiveness.
Well, I guess it's over to me again to keep our pattern of team working here and taking
together
turns.
Each achieves more, Jeremy.
So in our model, we call it effectiveness. And so this is, I guess, the piece that people often find easier to get their head around if they're involved in sport. So this is, what is it that we need to do? What are the skills and the capabilities that we need? What are the skills and capabilities that we have in order to be effective in the kind of team that we want to be? And I guess it might be helpful to give some examples here. So again, going back to the All Blacks, the All Blacks back in 2003, and probably over a period of about 3 or 4 years, spent a lot of time deciding what they wanted as their identity, what they wanted to give them an edge, and how did they want to play the game. And they came to the conclusion through discussion, and they created a player leadership group who were at the core of this, through discussion, that they wanted to play fast open rugby. So they talked about trusting the man outside you, no matter what the number is on his back, to trust the man outside you. They talked about, it doesn't matter where you are on the pitch, if it's on, it's on. If the shape of the defence allows you to attack and score a try, then you should attack and score a try. And what they discovered was, when they started to deploy this, was actually they simply didn't have the skill to deliver it. So yeah, it's nice to say trust the man outside you, but if he's not able to catch the ball, not able to pass the ball, then you're unable to be the team that you want to be. And so what the All Blacks did was fundamentally change the way in which they trained in order to develop the skills that were required for them to be effective in a way that's authentic with the identity that gave them their edge. And to give you another example from our experience, we worked with a county cricket club a couple of seasons ago, and they decided that their identity, what would give them an edge, would be to really focus on consistency. So they talked about brilliant consistency and squeezing the life out of the opposition. So the more dot balls you can bowl in succession, for instance, the higher the chance of you getting a wicket. So that when you get over about 20 dot balls, the chance is now getting up to 30-40% off every ball that you're going to get a wicket because the opponent is frustrated. So they fundamentally changed their training regime for bowling and for batting in order to do that. They changed the way in which they prepared the ground for matches in order to do that. They created a form of recognition. So up in the team changing room, they had a leaderboard for the combination of bowlers who had got the longest dot balls combinations, or dot ball strings they call them, and at the end of the season they gave an award to that pairing. So that's about taking a concept which is around how do we want to play, thinking it through into, therefore, what kind of skills do we need? And then think about how do we embed that into the system so that we remember it as often as we can, that we've fundamentally changed the way that we do things in order to achieve those things. So that's the final piece of the jigsaw puzzle.
Yeah, kind of, as you're talking there, especially at the end, you use two words, what and how. And if we think that every team ordinarily has an objective. Younger age groups, those objectives will probably revolve around the developmental piece or the participation piece. At more elite level sport, objectives revolve more around performance and outcomes. So here's our objectives. Okay, what do we have to do? What strengths do we have to create in order to achieve that objective? And then the how. How are we going to do that? And relating that to the identity of the group, relating that to the identity of the team. This is what we do here. This is how we go about our business. This is what separates us. Would that be kind of more or less the correct sort of summing up of what you're saying?
Yeah, and I think that you used a key word there. You talked about strengths, and earlier you talked about co-creation through an appreciative inquiry. Yeah. And I think those are both concepts that are fundamental to the approach that we take. We're talking about trying to hold conversations that lead to agreements around what's possible for us and who we want to be together, that engages and excites people with a sense of possibility and opportunity, and then turns that into a reality which is built around our strengths and how do we develop our strengths, rather than becoming a bit preoccupied with the negative side or what might go wrong. Now, that's not to say that there isn't time to talk about that. It's just to say that if I want to give you feedback around the things that you're not doing particularly well, then that works much better if it's in a context where you really understand why you should be doing these things and what is expected of you. And we're trying to give people that kind of clarity. So coming back to Will's example, 30% chance of a goal or a 70% chance of the goal, I'll pass the ball and let the other guy take the glory. And if you haven't scored, if you're a striker and you cost X million pounds and you haven't scored for 6 or 7 matches, the temptation to put yourself above the needs of the team become greater and greater. So that's when you require a stronger and stronger sense of us in order to make the best decision for a successful winning performance. And I think when you think about how that all comes together in a team sport, where you have thousands of decisions being made during the course of a match by a group of people who are not able to communicate about those decisions, they have to do them based on something that they've learned or something they believe in, then that's why those thousands or tens of thousands of decisions add up to a performance which on the upside could be more than 50% better than if there wasn't a shared identity and a shared understanding.
You know what, Jeremy and Will, I mean, a big part, it's interesting you're talking there about, in our business, as in your business, we use this model of appreciative inquiry and talking with organisations and sports teams and the military about their strengths and what happens when it goes right, and having discussions, so it's co-creating solutions. And I think the most impactful training I've done in my career has been using a framework called solution-focused brief therapy that you guys will know from your organisational work. And to people listening in, it's in a nutshell, in a very simple nutshell, it is about exploring your individual and group strengths and your best moments and things that you do have, the affordances you do have, and building from there. And it's I think, and you kind of alluded to it there, is that people and organisations forget about this is they're so busy looking at the weaknesses and I need to improve this weakness, and often the answer lies in the strengths and what you're doing well. And I call it, and I heard this from somebody who trained me in SFBT, solution focused breath therapy, and turning thin language into thick turning thin language into thick language, with the thick language being the strengths and the solutions and the good things in the organisations. That's got to become the big part of your language within an organisation. I think that's so important, isn't it?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And I was having a conversation with Martin Fenn from Gazing Performance, who came up with this idea of red head and blue head. So when I'm in my dysfunctional state, when I've had an emotional hijack, they refer to that as a red head. And their proposition is that you can, through training, you can learn to control when you're in that red zone, so that you can have some scripts that you prepare for yourself and some sort of cognitive rehearsals that you do in order to get yourself back in the blue. But actually the conversation with Martin, or the idea that he was saying, is it's interesting how organisations are always interested in focusing on the red, making the red smaller rather than making the blue bigger. So how do we make that functional zone just feel much more comfortable and much more expansive so that we can stay in it and we experience less threatening situations as we go through, a performance moment? Yeah,
I mean, I tend to use HPM and LPM. There's the old acronym again, Will. So it's a high performance mindset and low performance mindset, which allows me to sort of extend the notion of attention onto things like emotion and language and things. And what my first port of call, and I say this in my books and I say this, in my academy, is look, it's actually evidence of your HPM comes from your HP, your high performance. Your high performance mindset, evidence for me comes from your high performance a lot of the time. What are you doing when you're high performing? So there's a great deal of congruency between both of your thinking and my thinking. Guys, that has been absolutely superb. I've really, really enjoyed that conversation. Where can people find your work? You've got this fantastic white paper out, so how can people get in contact? How can they download that? Where can people find you?
Right, so we have a website which is called great-teams-academy.com. So greatteamsacademy.com with hyphens between. And people can go there and go to the Knowledge Hub, and they'll find that there's lots of articles about sport and business as well as the white paper that we've just been talking about. And we're also on Twitter. So, Will, what's your Twitter?
I knew you were going to ask me that, and I was thinking, I don't actually know it off by heart.
Okay, well, mine is Jeremy J. Holt.
Okay, mine's Dr. Will Thomas. At Dr. Will Thomas, no underscores or hyphens or anything.
Perfect. Brilliant. Okay, well, guys, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today. That was Jeremy Holt and Will Thomas, Dr. Will Thomas. That was absolutely fascinating, and I certainly learned a lot there that I'm going to, as I alluded to earlier, I'm going to shamelessly steal. If you enjoyed that, please do leave a rating and a review. And don't forget to subscribe to the Sports Psych Show to be alerted about future episodes. I look forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.